Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining my presentation. My name is Anika Denny, and I'm presenting from Irvine, California. I go to University High School, and I'm a senior, and my mentor is Omar S. And my project is called the Early Detection and Intervention in Bipolar Disorder, a review of the role of neuroimaging biomarkers. So my decision to research this topic is driven by the significant impact that bipolar disorder has on individuals and on society. BD is associated with a really high suicide rate and a poor clinical and functional result. And so the early detection and intervention of this illness can really improve the quality of life of those affected by bipolar disorder. So to start off, what is bipolar disorder, you might ask? So bipolar disorder, or BD, is a psychiatric condition that is characterized by mood swings, including emotional highs, called mania or hypomania, and emotional lows, called depression. And this illness affects more than 1% of the world's population, and so it's one of the primary causes of disability in youth, and it leads to cognitive and functional impairments, as well as increased mortality. And it's also almost always misdiagnosed. It's misdiagnosed in almost 60% of BD patients. And so they end up waiting 5 to 10 years before they actually receive an appropriate diagnosis. And so increased accuracy in the diagnosis of bipolar disorder is therefore a significant aspect of improving the health and treatment of patients with BD. And this is just an image showing the general symptoms of bipolar disorder. You have the manic episodes, which, for example, could be feeling overly happy for a long period of time. And it also has the depressive episodes, which could be feeling really sad or hopeless for a long period of time. Now, for the main part of my research, biomarkers. So biomarkers are basically objective measures that indicate normal biological processes, pathogenic processes, or pharmacologic responses to therapy. They can aid in identifying the specific characteristics associated with the diagnosis of BD and illness activity related to mood episodes. They can also help distinguish between unipolar and bipolar depression, map the progression and prognosis of the disorder, identify at-risk individuals via trait markers, detect the illness relapse before clinical symptoms even start, and direct the development of new therapies. And since this presentation involves a lot of brain structures that I'm going to mention, I wanted to take a minute to quickly address the key parts. So the right image shows the limbic system, and that's involved in our behavioral and our emotional responses. So people with BD may have an overactivated amygdala, for example, which could contribute to the extremes in emotional behaviors that are characterized by BD. The cingulate gyrus, for example, is also used for processing emotions and behavioral regulation, and that is one of the structural abnormalities that's present in bipolar disorder. On the left, you'll see the different lobes of the brain, like the parietal, frontal, temporal, and occipital, and the brainstem, which consists of the pons, medulla, and the midbrain. Now, moving on to the specific candidate biomarkers I'll be focusing on, this will be gray and white matter, cortical surface area, cortical thickness, ventricular volumes, and functional connectivity. Gray matter is basically made up of neuronal cell bodies, while white matter is made up of myelinated axons. Cortical surface area is the area of the gray and white matter boundary in the brain. Cortical thickness is the thickness of the gray matter in the brain. Ventricular volumes is the size of the brain's ventricles, which are fluid-filled spaces. And functional connectivity is a measure of how different brain regions interact with each other. Now, before I show you the various brain scans that are involved with studying these neuroimaging biomarkers, let me introduce two important imaging techniques, MRI and fMRI. So MRI stands for magnetic resonance imaging, and that's basically this non-invasive medical imaging technique that uses radio waves and a strong magnet to create a detailed image of the inside of the body. fMRI is the functional version of that, and that measures brain activity through changes in blood flow. And so when an area of the brain is in use, that means that blood flow to that region also increases. Now let's dive into our first biomarker, gray matter. And so studies found a decrease in gray matter in the bilateral superior frontal gyri, the left rostral anterior cingulate cortex, and right frontoinsular cortex of the brain in patients with BD. Now, all of this might sound really complex, but all you need to know is that these structures are regulating decision-making and emotion processing. They're limbic structures. And additionally, lithium is a medication that's commonly used to treat bipolar disorder, and that's because it helps to stabilize the mood swings and reduce the frequency and severity of the manic and depressive episodes. And so patients taking this medication reportedly had greater gray matter volumes, while those taking antipsychotic medications had volume deficits. And adequate gray matter is important because it allows for advanced mental development and processing, and it also allows for a decreased risk of developing cognitive impairment. And this image just shows the blue areas of smaller and red areas of greater gray matter volumes in patients with BD compared to those with healthy controls. Now, studies have also found white matter deficits in the prefrontal, frontotemporal, and cingulate regions. And this white matter reorganization might be contributing to the mood dysregulation, inability to control speech, and issues with memory and retention that are all characteristic of BD. And so white matter tract abnormalities were found in areas that control emotions. And these limbic areas are associated with decision-making and emotional processing, as I mentioned earlier, both of which are extremely impacted in BD. And then we have abnormal cortical thinning of temporal cortices coupled with thickness increases in the visual somatosensory areas of the brain. And so temporal cortices are responsible for the auditory information processing, understanding language, and playing a role in memory and emotion. The visual somatosensory brain regions are those that process visual information from the eyes and sensory information from the body. Now, cortical thickness is related to the size, number, and density of cells and dendrites in one cortical column. And the left interior temporal cortices were significantly thinner, which are responsible for visual processing, including face perception and number recognition. So overall, there was a widespread reduction of cortical thickness in bipolar disorder, especially observed in the prefrontal cortex. Now, cortical surface area, on the other hand, is the area of the gray and white matter boundary in the brain. Patients with BD reportedly had lower cortical surface area than healthy controls. Now, there were also reports of enlarged ventricles in BD patients compared to healthy controls. And patients with these enlarged ventricles at illness onset tend to have a worse illness course. And this is a great image that shows how both groups showed ventricular volume increases over time. Patients with BD showed much faster increases than the healthy control subjects. Now, functional brain networks are basically these groups of brain regions that work together to support cognitive functions, as shown in this picture. Now, two key brain networks that I'm going to be mentioning are the frontoparietal and the default mode network. So this is what those two look like. Now, various studies have been conducted to investigate the brain's functional connectivity networks in a resting state in patients with BD. Now, in this resting state, patients are not assigned a cognitive task, and they're told to rest quietly but awake with their eyes closed during the fMRI scan. Now, these studies have discovered abnormal resting state functional connectivity in the default mode network, as I mentioned before, the frontoparietal network, the salience network, and the affective network, or the limbic network in patients with BD compared to healthy controls. Now, mood did play a role in these abnormal functional connectivity in the DMN, but although it's reported in that sense during acute episodes in BD patients, it's not apparent during remission, which is when the BD patients don't have any symptoms of mania or depression. Now, during emotion processing and cognitive control tasks in bipolar remission, the BD patients had increased amygdala and subcortical activity and decreased dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity. Now, increased activity in the amygdala may contribute to the heightened emotional responses and mood swings that are commonly associated with BD patients. Now, increased activity in the subcortical structures relates to the dysregulation of mood and energy levels as seen in bipolar disorder, potentially contributing to the cycling between the manic and the depressive episodes. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity, that's crucial for executive functions like planning, decision-making, and working memory. Now, decreased activity in this cortex may lead to impairments in these cognitive functions, which can manifest as difficulties in concentration, impulse control, and decision-making. Now, this reduction in this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity is often linked to the cognitive deficits observed in bipolar disorder. And that's typically during the depressive episodes. So regarding our future goals, it is expected that the validated biomarkers will be useful diagnostic tools and aid in the provision of individually tailored treatment for BD patients. And so identifying these at-risk individuals at early stages of BD before the onset of the disorder can greatly improve the outcomes of this illness. And so increased accuracy in the diagnosis of bipolar disorder is a huge aspect of improving the health and treatment of patients with BD. And that is it for my presentation. Thank you all so much for listening, and I hope you learned something new.
Thank you, Anika. That was fascinating. I'm curious, did you learn anything in your research about, or did you form any opinions during your research about what the most promising treatment possibilities are?
So that's still up in the air because these biomarkers that I researched about, they're all still sort of being further analyzed by all of these different studies because there are varying results among studies. There have been meta-analyses conducted throughout hundreds of studies so far over the past decade or so. And so because of the variability in those results, it's really difficult to come across one solid cohesive result that we can analyze and form a treatment based on. And that's what we're working on through machine learning and AI. And those resources are helping us move forward in that direction to finding one cohesive result. And then we can focus on finding the treatments for it. But yeah, currently there's a lot of variability in the results. These are just the cohesive findings that I could find, but there's so much more out there and it's still in the works.
Exciting stuff. Thank you so much for sharing your work.